The Canadian wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast, untouched expanse of towering evergreens and frost-laden pines. The morning air was sharp, crisp with the bite of winter, each breath escaping Alan Harrison's lips in a swirling mist. The snow beneath his heavy boots crunched with every step, muffled yet distinct in the eerie stillness of the forest. He had walked these trails for years, patrolled these woods through every season, but today felt different. There was an unnatural quiet, the kind that set every instinct on edge. The usual symphony of nature, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of ravens, the soft scurrying of unseen creatures, was absent, replaced by a silence so absolute it pressed against his ears. Alan stopped mid-stride, scanning the treetops, the heavy branches weighed down by snow. The forest was holding its breath. A seasoned park ranger, Alan had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was on high alert. He tightened his grip on the straps of his pack, shifting slightly to ease the weight on his shoulders. The rifle slung across his back felt heavier than usual, though he had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. He wasn't afraid, at least not in the way a man fears the dark. It was something deeper, an unsettling awareness, as if the land itself was whispering a warning he couldn't quite understand. Then, a sound shattered the silence, low, guttural, and laced with something unmistakable: pain. Alan froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. This was not the distant call of a predator or the casual groan of an animal shifting in the cold. It was suffering, raw and unfiltered, and it was close. His pulse quickened, his breath coming out in measured exhales as he strained to listen. Another noise followed, a strained, ragged grunt, followed by a heavy, labored exhale. Alan's hands instinctively went to the radio on his belt, but he hesitated. Calling for backup would take too long, and whatever lay ahead needed help now. Bracing himself, he moved toward the source, his steps careful, deliberate. He had seen too many wounded animals react unpredictably, lashing out in desperation. His heart pounded as he pushed forward, weaving through the thick underbrush, his boots sinking slightly into the fresh snow. Then, just beyond the clearing, he saw it. A massive form lay sprawled against the frozen ground, dark fur streaked with crimson, breath shallow. A bear, and it was dying. The sharp, guttural sound cut through the dense forest like a blade, raw and desperate. Alan Harrison stopped mid-step, his breath hitching in his throat. He had heard countless animal calls in his years as a park ranger, cries of warning, howls of hunger, the eerie wails of creatures lost in the wilderness. But this was different. This was agony. His heartbeat quickened as the noise came again, closer this time, ragged and strained. It wasn't the distant echo of a predator's hunt, nor the startled cry of prey caught in a fleeting struggle. This was prolonged, pained, a deep, suffering groan, the kind that only came from an animal on the brink. Alan's fingers twitched toward his rifle, though he had no desire to use it. He knew better than to charge into the unknown, but his instincts screamed at him to move, to find the source. He forced himself to exhale slowly, steadying his breath. His pulse thundered in his ears as he scanned the tree line, the towering evergreens stretching endlessly in every direction, their thick trunks casting long, unmoving shadows across the snow. He stepped forward cautiously, boots crunching against the frozen ground, each movement deliberate and controlled. The sound came again, a low, trembling whimper followed by a heavy exhale. Whatever was making that noise was struggling, dying, maybe. His muscles tensed as he approached a small clearing where the trees parted just enough to let in pale shafts of light. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, faint but unmistakable: blood. Alan's stomach tightened. He had dealt with poachers before, had seen their handiwork, traps left to rot in the underbrush, snares buried beneath the snow, waiting for an unsuspecting creature to step into them. The thought sent a cold chill through him, colder than the winter air biting at his face. As he rounded a thick cluster of pines, the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. A massive bear lay sprawled in the snow, its powerful body trembling with exhaustion, thick fur matted with blood. Its limbs were splayed awkwardly, the pristine white snow beneath it stained a sickening shade of crimson. Alan's breath caught as his gaze followed the dark stains to the source. 3 cruel, rusted metal snares, their jagged edges biting deep into the bear's flesh. The beast let out another weak, guttural moan, its massive chest rising and falling in uneven, ragged breaths. It was trapped, and it was running out of time. The sight before Alan sent a cold wave of dread through his chest. The bear, a towering creature of raw strength and power, lay sprawled in the snow, its massive frame trembling, muscles twitching in pain. Its thick fur, meant to protect against the brutal winter cold, was streaked with deep, crimson gashes. The contrast against the pristine white snow was sickening. This was no natural wound. This was suffering inflicted by man. Alan's eyes scanned the scene with practiced precision, his breath slow and measured despite the knot tightening in his stomach. 3 separate traps, each one strategically placed to ensure maximum agony. The first was a heavy-duty snare coiled around the bear's front leg, its rusted wire digging mercilessly into thick muscle. The second gripped its hind leg, twisted unnaturally, restricting movement. But the worst of them all, the one that made Alan's jaw clench with silent fury, was a brutal jaw trap, its serrated edges clamped over the bear's other front paw, biting deep into flesh, tearing through fur and sinew. The bear let out a low, guttural groan, its body shuddering as it failed to move. Its breath came in ragged, uneven pants, visible in the cold morning air. Alan didn't need to be a veterinarian to know the truth. If left like this, the bear wouldn't survive much longer. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Every survival instinct told him to turn back. This was a full-grown grizzly, a predator capable of snapping a man in half with a single swipe. Injured or not, it was dangerous. A cornered animal was unpredictable. And yet, as Alan met its gaze, something inside him shifted. The bear's dark eyes weren't filled with rage or aggression. There was no wild, untamed fury in them, only exhaustion, resignation, a silent acknowledgement of its fate. Alan exhaled, long and slow. He had seen fear in animals before, deer caught in snares, foxes trapped in fences, but this was something else. This bear wasn't just in pain, it had already accepted that it was dying. Something deep in Alan's chest twisted at the thought. His hands tightened into fists. No, not today. Carefully, deliberately, he took a slow step forward. The bear's ears twitched, but it didn't react beyond that. Alan raised his hands, his voice barely above a whisper, steady and calm. Easy, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you. The bear didn't move. It simply watched. Alan knew the risks. He knew that this was reckless. But as he knelt beside the first trap, reaching into his pack for the heavy-duty wire cutters, he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to walk away. Alan's pulse thundered in his ears as he knelt beside the first trap. His breath came slow and steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the heavy-duty wire cutters in his pack. He had freed trapped animals before, foxes, deer, even a wolf once, but never something this massive, this powerful. Every rational thought told him to turn back, to wait for backup. But deep down, he knew there was no time. If he didn't act now, the bear wouldn't survive the hour. The metal snare wrapped around the bear's front leg was thick, its rusted coils digging deep into the muscle. Dried and fresh blood mingled where the steel had cut through fur and flesh. Alan positioned the cutters over the wire, his gloved fingers tightening around the handles. One sharp movement and the trap would snap open. One wrong move and the bear could lash out in pain. A single swipe ending everything. He exhaled and squeezed. With a loud snap, the wire gave way. The bear flinched, its massive body tensing. Alan's muscles coiled, ready to retreat if necessary, but the creature did nothing. It only let out a slow, shuddering exhale, its dark eyes fluttering with exhaustion. Relief flooded Alan's chest, but there was no time to pause. He moved swiftly to the bear's hind leg, where the second snare was wrapped tight. This one was older, rusted almost solid. Alan gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip on the cutters. The steel resisted, groaning under the pressure, but after a few tense seconds, it gave way. The trap sprung open with a jolt. The bear let out a low, guttural groan. Pain, maybe, or relief, but still, it did not fight him. Only one trap remained. Alan's stomach twisted as he turned his attention to the final and worst of them all, the jaw trap clamped around the bear's front paw. Its serrated teeth were buried deep, cutting through sinew, the metal soaked in blood. This was the real danger. The moment he pried it open, the pain would surge through the bear's body, triggering its instincts. If it had the strength to fight, this was when it would do it. Alan repositioned himself, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He placed the cutters at the thickest point of the trap, his breath coming in shallow, controlled pulls. The bear's breathing was slow but ragged. Its dark eyes flickered, watching him, waiting. He pressed down with all his strength. The metal resisted. Sweat formed beneath Alan's collar despite the frigid air. He gritted his teeth, forcing the cutters deeper. Then, snap! The jaws of the trap loosened. The bear let out a deep, rumbling groan, its massive frame jerking slightly before slumping back into the snow. Alan fell onto his heels, breathless. The job was done. The bear was free. But as he looked down at its wounded, bleeding limbs, he knew this wasn't over yet. The bitter cold gnawed at Alan's exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His breath came in short, controlled exhales, misting in the frigid air as he watched the bear lying motionless before him. The beast was free of the traps, but it was far from safe. Deep gashes marred its thick fur, blood pooling sluggishly in the snow, its breath shallow and uneven. Alan had seen injuries like these before. If left untreated, infection would set in, and the bear wouldn't stand a chance. He should walk away. He had done his part. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, to put distance between himself and the wounded predator. A full-grown grizzly, no matter how weak, was still an apex predator. One wrong move, one misstep, and it could lash out with what little strength it had left. But as he met its gaze, something in him refused to move. The bear was watching him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something quieter, something Alan couldn't quite define. Exhaustion, yes. Pain, certainly. But there was something else, a stillness, a strange acceptance. As if the bear understood that, for better or worse, Alan was not its enemy. Slowly, cautiously, Alan reached for his radio, his fingers stiff from the cold. "Base, this is Harrison," he said, voice low, steady. "I've got an emergency, wounded grizzly, severe lacerations, requesting immediate response from Wildlife Rescue." Static crackled on the other end before a voice came through. "Say again, Alan? Did you say a grizzly?" Alan's gaze never left the bear. "Yeah, big one. Bad shape. We need to move fast." There was a pause. Then, "Copy that. Teams mobilizing. ETA, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. An eternity when sitting mere feet from a creature powerful enough to end him in seconds. He should step back. He should put distance between them. But instead, his fingers moved to his pack, pulling out what little medical supplies he carried. He tore strips of gauze, wrapping them carefully around the bear's worst wounds, working as quickly as he dared. The beast flinched, a deep rumble rolling through its chest, and Alan froze. But the bear didn't attack. It didn't try to move. Instead, it exhaled, a slow, exhausted sigh, and let him continue. Alan didn't dare breathe. The trust between them was fragile, threadbare. But for now, in this frozen clearing, it was enough. The low hum of the helicopter blades cut through the crisp morning air, sending ripples across the treetops as Alan watched from the edge of the clearing. His breath curled in the freezing air, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the massive form being carefully secured onto a reinforced stretcher. Thick straps wrapped around its limbs, ensuring minimal movement during transport. The bear, sedated but still breathing, lay motionless. Its chest rose and fell in slow, labored breaths, each exhale a visible cloud against the frigid air. Alan swallowed hard. He had done everything he could out here in the wild. Now it was out of his hands. The team worked swiftly, their practiced efficiency evident in every movement. Mark, one of the senior wildlife specialists, gave him a nod. "We're taking it straight to the rehabilitation center. It's lost a lot of blood, but if we move fast, it's got a chance." A chance. Alan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest refusing to ease. He should feel relieved, knowing help had finally arrived, but instead, unease settled in his gut. This wasn't over yet. As they loaded the stretcher into the helicopter, Alan found himself moving forward without thinking. "I'm coming with it," he said firmly, gripping the overhead rail as he climbed in before anyone could argue. Mark gave him a long look, but didn't protest. "Figured you'd say that." The doors sealed shut, and within moments, the aircraft lifted off, the endless expanse of forest shrinking below them. The ride was rough, the wind battering against the metal frame, but Alan barely noticed. His gaze remained locked on the bear. Even sedated, its body bore the marks of suffering. Deep gashes, raw wounds, dried blood staining its thick fur. It should be dead, but somehow it had held on. Alan knew enough about the wild to understand that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about will. And something inside this bear refused to give up. As they neared the rehabilitation center, he tightened his grip on the rail. Neither had said it, but he and the bear had crossed an unspoken boundary, one of trust, however fragile. And now, as they prepared for the next battle, one fought not against traps, but against time, Alan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away, not yet. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as Alan stood at the edge of the Wildlife Reserve's enclosure. A heavy silence hung between the towering trees, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the rustling of wind through the underbrush. In the clearing before him, the bear moved slowly, cautiously, testing its strength with each deliberate step. It had been weeks since that day in the forest, weeks of treatment, slow recovery, and careful observation. At first, the bear had been weak, barely able to lift its head. The wounds, deep and merciless, had taken their toll. But against all odds, it had endured. The torn muscles had begun to heal, the infection had subsided, and the fire in its eyes had returned. It had survived what should have been impossible. Now, it was time to go home. Alan tightened his grip on the straps of his pack, his breath steady but heavy in his chest. He had spent so many hours by the bear's side, watching it regain its strength, speaking in hushed tones when no one else was around. He had studied its movements, its expressions, the way it had started watching him with something deeper than simple recognition. And now, standing here, he felt something strange twist inside him. The gate of the transport crate was unlocked. The path to freedom laid bare. The bear hesitated, lifting its head to take in the world beyond the fence. The forest stretched endlessly before it, untouched and wild, the only home it had ever known. For a moment, it stood there, its massive frame framed by the early morning light, nostrils flaring as it took in the crisp scent of the trees. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it moved forward. Alan didn't blink, didn't shift, he simply watched. The bear reached the tree line and paused, its hulking form still and quiet. Then, as if sensing the weight of Alan's gaze, it turned just enough for their eyes to meet one final time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. A low, steady huff rumbled from the bear's chest before it turned away and disappeared into the dense foliage. Alan exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly, his fingers unclenching from where they had gripped his pack. It was free, and somehow he knew. This wasn't the last time their paths would cross. In a world where the wilderness is shrinking and human actions often dictate the fate of creatures who have roamed these lands long before us, this story serves as a powerful reminder. Compassion knows no boundaries. Alan could have walked away. He could have left the bear to its fate, rationalizing that nature must take its course. But he didn't. Instead, he chose kindness. He chose to act. And that made all the difference. Wildlife cannot speak for itself. It cannot beg for mercy or plead for a second chance. But that doesn't mean it doesn't deserve one. Every action we take, whether it's protecting natural habitats, reporting illegal poaching, or simply respecting the balance of nature, has a lasting impact. The bear's survival wasn't just about luck. It was about someone caring enough to step in, to fight for a life that so many would have overlooked. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. When we choose empathy, when we see beyond fear and into the heart of another being, we forge something unbreakable. A bond, a responsibility, a promise to protect, to preserve, and to respect the world we share. Because every life matters, even the ones we don't fully understand.